Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us here. Another Threat Thursday Live. As you can see, we have a different face than normal down here. We have Jake from BC Security. If you guys haven't met this man before, goes by Hubble. He's one of the big brains that's doing actually a lot of kind of cool stuff. I won't steal your thunder. I'll let you do your own quick intro real fast.
Thanks, Trey. Yeah, I'm Jake. Go by Hubble, as Trey said. Over at BC Security, you've probably heard of us if you've used the Empire C2 framework. That's probably what we're most well known for. But we do a large amount of research on, specifically on like threat emulation. And then we also do some embedded systems engineering. We published about 6 CVEs last year and gave a talk over at DEF CON on hacking solar power inverters for like homes. So that was kind of cool. But Trey asked me here to do an overview of Turla because that's kind of one of my passion projects that we'll get into as we do an overview of them.
Yep, that is a good way to bring us into it. So, as he said, we're here talking Turla today, or Secret Blizzard, Venomous Bear, pick your name. They go by about 30, depending on what vendor you're looking at. Overall, they were really active, kind of really big, prominent on the APT scene. And I know this was, like you said, a pet project for you, and you dove into it a lot. So I wanted to bring you on and give people a chance to kind of hear about some of the research you did and get some insight into the group also known as Turla.
Yeah. So, as Trey, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to step on you, Trey.
No, you're good. I was just moving your screen up.
Okay, cool. So as Trey said, yeah, cool. So as Trey said, Turla goes by a ton of names. The biggest ones are Venomous Bear, Waterbug Snake, and then Secret Blizzard is what Microsoft calls them. They've been active for a long time. There was a ton of reporting on them through about 2023. There was like regular updates. But they are associated with the FSS in Russia, which is a government arm. And so there's been less reporting on them in the last 3 years. If you notice that timeline, that kind of lines up with the start of the Ukraine war. And most of the reporting on them since the start of that war has been activities in Ukraine. So a lot of uh, the suspected reasoning for a lot of seeing a drop in the reporting is that they've been so focused on primary target has been government agencies and diplomatic entities, and targeting like military and defense organizations, along with some energy stuff as well. Um, but but going all the way back to 2011, they've done a ton of stuff with spear phishing. One of the interesting things, some highly stealthy TTPs they use. They also fall back a lot on very basic like initial compromises. So everything they do is pretty much always through spear phishing or some kind of social engineering. And they're almost always looking for informational espionage, trying to get stuff. So they had a big campaign in 2014 after 2011 using a rootkit known as Snake. That was kind of what brought them onto the scene as being like one of the preeminent APTs that were being tracked at the time. And it was capable of exfiltrating data, bypassing security measures, and like maintaining long-term persistence. All the stuff that we now associate with just common C2 capabilities, but back in 2014 was a lot more novel at the time. So in 2017, they had another backdoor that they released. One of the other things that you may see throughout this is there's a common thread throughout Turla's activities is they almost always use some form of .NET, whether that's PowerShell, Iron Python, C Sharp. Almost all of their TTPs eventually go through a .NET assembly, which is one of the things that makes them a little different than some of the other APTs that we see common reporting on that have almost all shifted to unmanaged code at this point.
Yeah, that was something I was going to ask you. That was very common or not?
You mean for Turla or just APTs in general? We've seen for APTs in general, we've seen a migration away from .NET, more towards the unmanaged code, mostly because of how difficult it's gotten to patch AMSI in an effective way that doesn't either get you detected or undone. And so, but there is some interesting tradecraft that I'll hit on. I don't think I have a slide on it, but they tend to use .NET, um, like I said, but they use Iron Python. That was kind of what started our passion project on Turla. Was they had one sample that was leaked a couple of years ago that was called Iron Net Injector, and it leverages using Iron Python, which uses a different compiler than the traditional .NET assemblies that like C# uses, because of the fact that it's a dynamic execution language and it uses different abstract syntax trees than the normal .NET without diving too much into the technicals of that. And so it results in going through a compiler that doesn't currently have any hooks in it, and the ETW events are very sparse. So we suspect that they're still using those TTPs, and when I've talked to some people, not on the record, I've kind of gotten vague confirmations that they still see those activities, mostly talking to some people I ran into at conferences and stuff that have been involved in some of the Ukraine cyber stuff. And so there's some interesting things going on there. Um, but to jump back over to my slide, the solar winds was the biggest one that everyone knows about that Turlo is involved in. They, compromised everyone, and it was a really big deal using a bunch of different TTPs. But the main thing was going upstream for the supply chain, and that SolarWinds was the first we saw of many where we started seeing attackers move up the supply chain rather than trying to individually compromise entities. They just go, compromise a big software supplier. We've seen this a ton with like NPM now,
Yep.
for
And
Node.
Notepad plus plus and
Yeah, Notepad++. So this has become a favorite way of distributing malware for APTs, especially nation state sponsored APTs. It's just way easier to compromise and let everyone download those applications and then have it be deployed, and then you can figure out whose boxes you have compromised and go from there. And because of the fact that they're leveraging trust from those applications, even if people get alerted about things being like malicious or whatever, a lot of times people are just false positive. But SolarWinds kind of set that off. Then we went back to Snake again. So they tend to, one of the other interesting things about Turla is they tend to iterate on their internal tools. So, open source, free and open source tools are using like Cobalt Strike. And then they kind of will use a piece of malware for a few years or for a few months to a year, and then kind of move on to a new piece that they either modify from another open source project or something like that. Turla actually has like a dedicated development pipeline. And so if I go back a few slides, you'll see down here at the bottom, it said replace older backdoors such as Carbon and Kazar. Um, the most recent reporting um, on Turla actually has Kazar version 3. And so they've been using that for like 8 years now. And so they have a dedicated development team from all the open source information we're finding, which makes it a really different use case than some of the other APTs we see out of like North Korea and China. China does have some APTs that do have this dedicated development pipeline, but they're really the only Turla, and I'm totally blanking on the correct designation for the Chinese APT that makes like the China chopper and stuff. But those are really the only two APTs that we see have like dedicated pipelines with like long-term reuse cases and upgrades to the software they're using, which really is a strong indicator that it's backed by nation state governments and not just people doing like freelancing. Because Russia also has a large like anywhere but here policy where they have a lot of hacker groups that are not directly associated with the government, but the way the relationship works is that if the government comes and asks a favor, that they're expected to do it in return for having kind of like legal cover for ransomware groups and that kind of stuff, where They can do whatever they want as long as they don't target anything within the Russian influence sphere. And Russia will protect them and not turn them over to authorities. But it's expected that when Russia comes and asks for favors, they do it. Those groups tend to have more of that pattern where they pick up and modify open source tools and use it for a few months to a year, then abandon it and go on to a new piece of software versus that dedicated pipeline. Apollo Shadow was kind of the most recent one from last year. And this was within Moscow, and we'll just go over to this, show some of the stuff. But it was within Moscow, within the local ISPs. So the big thing from that, I'll zoom in so you guys can see this a little better. Oh, the big thing from that was that it was leveraging Russia's domestic intercept systems. So another like strong indicator that it's like direct government backing, because they were using like the law enforcement capabilities within the ISP infrastructure to intercept information from embassies. So they then used the embassy stuff to convince the target machines to download trusted root certificates under the guise of Kaspersky AV. So again, you've probably heard that Kaspersky is banned within the US for like government use and stuff, and some people have questioned that, but we constantly see overlaps with Turla and some of the other APTs where they're using like Kaspersky's stuff as cover to install things. Um, it could still be that Kaspersky is kind of um, not a volunteer in that cooperation, but there's too many instances where we see overlaps with compromises within Kaspersky to not believe that at the very least the Russians have a backdoor into it that Kaspersky knows about and doesn't do anything to change because they're not allowed to.
Yeah, it's better. I'm sorry there.
Yeah. So, but this was like this. I took this. You can see that they use VB script. This was the thing that I wanted to highlight. And then even more recently, I found someone that had done some reverse engineering. This was published last month, going back to that Kazar version 3. Um, this is just like from like Malwarepedia, and someone linked the stuff. And I'm not entirely convinced on some of their reverse engineering conclusions in this article, but it does show that again they're going like VB script and .NET loading to get back into their stuff, which is really interesting. And it follows all of the tradecraft that's well established for C2s. Like it's still just they drop stuff into the local app data. They sideload a DLL to be able to load in a .NET assembly. They load the .NET assembly, and then they blind AMSI and ETW, which has been the path forward for like Empire and Cobalt Strike and all that stuff for almost 10 years now. And so one of the things that I always like to hit on when talking about threat emulation um, and tools, especially open source tools, is it doesn't take as much obfuscation as people think to get past stuff. So a lot of what they do is they just XOR encode key strings and have a few control flow execution diversions that prevent the in-memory scanning of like Defender and other AV tools from being able to identify those specific pieces. And then they're just using like 10-year-old TTPs because there's no reason to not use those because it still works if you like apply your obfuscation and the TTPs correctly. Um,
A really cool insight, because that's something we've been noticing as well as we run a lot of our engagements. Is it's almost like coming back around full circle to like what's old is new again. A lot of the old stuff that you would think is like patched and gone and just not really viable is all of a sudden the easiest route in.
Yeah,
And
I like to call it like detection rotation, because basically what happens there is, um, and when you stop and think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Is there's only so much data and signatures that like these AVs can maintain, and so they maintain what they are seeing most recently. And so when you have a TTP that hasn't been used for 10 years, it tends to get dropped off. So like, let me see, I believe it was in here that they have it. I might have scrolled past already, but they were just using like in this most recent loader for the Kazar backdoor. They're just straight up using. Oh yeah, it's in here. They're just straight up using W shell, which for a long time, like if you go back like 5, 6, 7 years, this would have gotten you flagged like instantaneously by every AV on the planet because that's how everyone was launching stuff. And now Turla has just rotated back to just using W shell again because no one, since all of the malware abandoned using it, no one's running detections for it anymore. So it's just a really interesting thing, and it's also I've seen it less the last few years, which is good. Of like people memeing about like, oh, I thought they were supposed to be advanced, but being able to run and understand the detection patterns within the AV products that they're targeting is a really advanced capability to be able to understand. Hey, you know, because first you
We're losing
or
you.
the cracking that W shell is being, they're just using, like I said, wscript.shell. This was, if you ever did any VBA malware, this was like the original way of launching VBA malware 10 years ago, out of Windows macros. And so it's just kind of all come back around. So that's cool that you guys are seeing it too, Trey.
Oh yeah, definitely. That was some pretty good insight on that there. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Um, So I don't know if there's anything else, if anyone had any questions. I wanted to keep this kind of short for questions, and not bore people too much with technicalities. Um, I was, but we can go through some more campaigns. I have some other things I can talk to if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, no, you're right about on time, good sir. We usually try to stick to that 20 minutes, and we're right in that window still.
Okay, cool.
One kind of questions that have come up is what's been some of the new and interesting behaviors we're seeing from them? Maybe not necessarily
Per-
like unique, but something that you just went, wow, that's actually really cool. They did that, or they went that particular route.
so I think the most interesting thing that they've been doing is kind of this, not just this W script shell, but if you um this is like an entirely old school campaign. They're using the W script shell to drop stuff to into an app data folder to sideload stuff that then drops persistence into the startup folder. And so just seeing that kind of like return to like true um like old school techniques has been really interesting. And I don't know that this isn't specific to Turla, but one of the other things that I think has become really noticeable just from APTs and some of the red teaming reports and stuff that I've seen is we're seeing a migration out of in-memory TTPs. Basically, in-memory protections, since they've been the focus for the last 10 years with like PowerShell and all that stuff, have become really, really good. Um, and it's actually become less detrimental, especially with the advent of all these cloud storages and like you have like your OneDrive that's um, synced to your local computer. Files are constantly coming on and off disk now, and so it's become much less of a red flag to drop files to disk. And we've seen a large migration of APTs in general, just abandoning the like full in memory TTPs to just drop stuff to disk and then reload it that way because the protections, um, if you dig into Microsoft protections and AV protections and EDRs, they generally, if something is being loaded from disk, gets assumed to be safe because they're assuming that something else has scanned it, and then they're entirely focused on that in-memory piece. And so there's tons of stuff. I don't have any samples that I had pulled up. I should have prepped them. Um, um, and so um, sorry for that. But there's cases where if you try to run something in memory, it'll get blocked. But if you just run it from disk, then it won't have any issues. So that was just kind of a cool thing there.
No, that's actually an interesting take. We've kind of been seeing mixed kind of setups here lately, where a lot of the times, most everything now is seeing like the in-memory execution and unmanaged PowerShell and stuff like that. The kicker to it is it's not always showing up in the same manner or same place as you would expect to see it from traditional logging and stuff like that. So it's making it a little still weird for teams to see, find, and hunt through it, or even just having alerting set. But all in all, that's pretty cool seeing that people are moving back to on disk versus trying to be as quiet and less intrusive as possible. Well, cool. That was right about 20 minutes. Thanks for coming in and talking with us today about Turla and what all you kind of seen them doing and a lot of the research you did into. I know we talked about this quite at length, so it's always fun to kind of get a refresher with that. For those that didn't know, we actually did a little bit of a collaboration. It was what, last year, I want to say? We did a workshop and built some threats together for Turla specifically. So if you guys didn't catch that, I would recommend going to look at it. And for those of y'all that are site customers or looking at the platform, we've got an awesome threat built for you and some detections as well that you could take, especially for some of these behaviors like the C script stuff and the VB script dropper. We've got some help for you. So with that in mind, thanks for coming to hang out with us today, everybody, and thanks for your time, Hubble. Appreciate you.
Yeah, have a good one.
Right. Till next time.